Good evening. And they still have... I'm getting bulletin announcement stuff here. All right, so a couple of things to announce. The ladies have a conference taking place here 2 weeks from yesterday, so on the 25th. Not this coming Saturday, the Saturday after that. So if you'd like some details about it, Mary's here. There are some handouts. If you'd like to invite some friends, ladies, there are little cards out there between the double doors as you exit. It'll have the list of speakers on it, I'm assuming. I didn't look at it that close. So it will have all the details for you. So with that, there is also a youth retreat that's coming up. And they've got some extra spaces. So if you know a youth-ite, that is junior high and high school in this one, right? So junior high and high school, and there are some spots open. If you have family, friends, whatever, and you know some high school, junior high school age kids that you'd like to see go on this, they have sign-ups happening for that. If you want details, of course, you can see them in where the kids are meeting. Actually, you could ask Brittany about it. She's in the first room down here on the left with all the girls. They do a thing on Sunday nights, and so she's going to be closest if you want to get some details about it. We have a men's retreat that's going to be coming up too, since we're talking about retreats and things like that. We have one that's going to be coming up September the 11th through the 13th up at Pinecrest, and it's going to be real old school. So if any of you guys are old school, this is how it's going to feel. So Odin Fong is going to do the worship for it. And he'll be bringing his church with him, and so will Terry Reynolds. These are guys that are real close to Chuck over the years, and so it'll be like the ones I remember when I first came here. The first men's retreat I ever went to in 1986 had such a different feel than most of the retreats that you see nowadays. So we're going to go back to what those were like and talk about how that was. And man, again, 86, if you'd have told me back then, hey, you're going to stick around this church for a while, and one of these days you're going to be the pastor around here. And I said, there's a padded cell for you somewhere around and a straitjacket. You might want to go check into that. I would have thought that is crazy talk, and yet here we are. So I want to just point out something that I find interesting, the timing of it. Because of where we were this morning. You know, we're in chapter 16 of the book of Revelation, looking at the 6 of the 7 bowl judgments. And then here we are tonight going through the book of Esther. And I didn't plan either one of those things. It just so happens that that's where we are. Now, the common theme is that God isn't mocked. And God does not take sin and threats and the things that man devises. He doesn't take those things lightly. So, as with this morning, man's rebellion against him will be met with God's judgment, period. It's just the easy, simplest way of putting it. Here, Haman devises a way where he's going to eradicate all of the Jews. Now, you don't need a whole lot of imagination to think when you see the premise of this book. The Jews are in captivity. Somebody comes up with a plan of how to wipe them all out, and that plan comes to the knowledge of the powers that be. How did we think this was going to work out? So you could have probably written this book in about 2 sentences, but instead it goes into a lot of detail, and a lot of times you're going to find, we're going to probably get through the end of the book tonight, because the way that this is all set up, it is, here's the plan. It's brought to the king. The king asks Esther what she would like for him to do. She gives the explanation, and so it's carried out. And that repeats through the rest of the book. So with that said, I find there's some real irony in this. How about you guys? Do you like irony? In fact, I wanted to give you the textbook definition of irony. So I went to the internet, and I grabbed the definition of irony. Now, what's really fun is to see some of the artwork that people have put together, what we would call memes. And irony, and some of it was really, really funny. People are very, very clever. So they find all kinds of pictures where ironic things happen. One of them that I thought was really funny was a guy that had obviously had a car accident, and his car was upside down, and it had hit the marquee right outside of a Target. And actually he hit the part of the Target sign that was lacking the Target. And it just missed off to the side. I said, oh, so close. Irony. Irony. That's funny. Now, of course, I hope that the guy was okay, because that would make it really funny if nothing happened to the guy. But, there's all that kind of stuff. Irony says a situation that is strange or funny because things happen in a way that seems to be opposite of what you would expect. Now, interestingly enough, when you hear that the second highest official in all of the Persian Empire, this Haman, devises a plan and gets the king to sign off on it to eradicate all the Jews, if we didn't know that God sides with his people and would not let something like that happen, we would expect it to happen exactly as it was laid out. But, of course, we know that there is a God who intervenes in such things, so we would expect, in the ultimate twist of irony, that everything that Haman had devised would come back on him. That's what we would expect if God was involved. And so if that would be your expectation, you could have written the book of Esther. So we are going to take a look at the closing chapters. We are in chapter 7 tonight. And I am also reminded of one thing before we go on. The days in which we live. We are just about to the midway point of July 2015. By tomorrow, my guess and my expectation is that we will announce that we have reached some kind of a tentative agreement with Iran over their nuclear program. Why does that have anything to do with what we're talking about tonight? Well, go look at the streets in Tehran and you will see all the protests. They're burning our flag and Israel's in effigy and shouting death to America and death to Israel. And, of course, we are helping to grease the skids by which they can put together their war machine that would be nuclear. And they have every intention of using it in warlike manner. And, of course, they want to go after Israel. But as Benjamin Netanyahu said, look, you guys are doing what you're doing and you're letting them develop weapons. We're already in range of everything that they have. This is intended to get to Europe and then to you. And it's true. And yet, our administration is just as dense as they could be when it comes to this, and they are just wanting so much to have something on paper that'll never see the light of day in actuality. So the blindness that is happening in this world and in our country in particular, I think, is something that God is allowing and putting that blinder on because that is the direction that we want to go. The stuff that we're doing makes no sense whatsoever. None. And yet we still seem to be going headlong towards that. I would ask you, as we should all, to be praying for the administration and for our leaders, because as I like to point out, when you look at Genesis chapter 12, verse 3, and God said to Abram that I'm going to bless those that bless you and I'll curse those that curse you. Yeah, he was talking to Abram through whom he made this covenant with Israel, and he never rescinded that. So he's had his problems with them, and they've done plenty of things that have really created difficulties for the Jewish people, but God is still as dedicated to them as ever. And we need to keep that in mind. So with that said, Esther chapter 7, let's have a word of prayer. Father, we thank you for gathering us here, and we're grateful for your word and how you speak to us through it. We would pray that you would give us ears to hear and see the interesting similarities, how things were then and how little changes. What we know is that the enemy has had a hatred for your people since these days, before these days, and even in our times today. It is a repeating thing. You will, of course, come to their assistance as you did here, and we just pray, Father, that we would recognize that this is still your pattern and it will always be. We thank you, we give you praise and honor for your faithfulness and for you being the God who makes covenants through whom we have been saved. The God who makes covenants as you've done with us. And we thank you, we give you praise and honor in Jesus' name. Amen. One thing I want to point out, and I think it's very important for us too, because again, right now, right here in this country and in this world, we have churches, and so many of them are here in the United States, that take the view we call replacement theology. That all of the promises made to Israel have now been given to the church by default because of Israel's rebellion at some time in the past. Now, of course, it doesn't hold up to any biblical scrutiny, but as with most bad teachings in the church, it's not based upon any sound biblical reason. It is just doctrines of men. So as we consider these things and as we watch what's taking place in our world today, let's once again remember, I saw that there's an entire organization of churches that are moving on the Obama administration to put pressure and boycott Israel because of its, quote, occupation of the West Bank and Gaza. Now, if you ever hear somebody call Israel occupiers of the West Bank and Gaza, they have just demonstrated their gross ignorance. That means that they don't understand what's happening there in the world, and they don't realize the people that are engaged in the struggle. So with that said, interestingly enough, I want to take a look at how God has dealt with his people before and be reminded that he will continue to do so until the Lord returns. Chapter 7, the book of Esther says this. So the king and Haman went to dine with Queen Esther. Now, it's been some weeks since we've been in this, so the reminder to us all, the whole thing comes to Mordecai's understanding. He mentions it to Esther. Esther is then put in the place of going before the king. She realizes that this could get her killed. And so then Mordecai has to tell her, well, it may very well be for this reason that you were born. And so she does go before the king and finds favor with him. And so, of course, now is the time. She's going to come before the king. She's asked him these few things. Haman has already put in place his plans to kill off all of the Jewish people throughout all of the provinces that are there in Xerxes, Persia. And so this is where we are. And now, when you were with us the last time, if you were here, in all of the irony, and I had a real fun time with it. I thought it was pretty hilarious, where Mordecai is just bothered because, boy, he gets invited to this great thing that Esther's putting on, but for whatever reason, he cannot get over this hang-up that this Mordecai will not bow to him. And he says, as long as Mordecai is alive, I can't even get excited about being invited to hang out with the king and the queen. I can't be happy about this. So, of course, the people that are closest to him and his wife said, well, build gallows and hang Mordecai, and then go to your feast and enjoy yourself. Well, how twisted is that? I can't be happy unless that guy's dead. Well, go kill him and then enjoy yourself at the feast. Man's heart, right? So let me, if I can, because I just think it's ironic, me and my irony. Chapter 5 of Esther, verse 14, it says, then his wife, Zeresh, and all of his friends said to him, let the gallows be made 50 cubits high, and in the morning suggest to the king that Mordecai be hanged on it. Then go merrily with the king to the banquet. And the king and the thing pleased Haman, so he built the gallows. Well, as we find out what ends up happening here, of course, this is all starting to go very, very poorly for him. And so by the time chapter 6, verse 13 rolls around, Haman told his wife Zeresh and all of his friends everything that had happened to him. His wise men and Zeresh said to him, now what things happened? Well, the king can't sleep. I wonder why. And so God says, hey, you know, there was that time that you got bailed out. I wonder who it was that helped you out in that time. And so they bring to him the chronicles. They bring to him the history. And turns out it's that Mordecai. Mordecai is the one who tipped him off, and he was going to be assassinated by a couple of guys, but Mordecai came to his aid, and it was unknown to the king at that time until God won't let him get any sleep, starts getting his mind thinking in those directions, and then he says, bring me the history books. I want to find out who it was that saved my bacon. Well, I don't know about bacon at the time. It wouldn't have been really a problem because this was a Jewish thing, and Xerxes was a pagan, so he could have eaten bacon if they had figured out how to cure, well, you know. Anyway, so, what terms. So we get to this place where here all of it comes to pass, and Mordecai is the guy, and so then they bring in Haman before the king, and then, of course, Haman being the kind of, you know, self-absorbed guy that he is, when Xerxes says, hey, if there's a guy that I really, 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 really liked, what do you think I should do for him? Oh, well, obviously he's talking about me. Well, you just give him all the best of everything. Put him on a horse, you know, put robes on him, and, you know, make everybody know just how much you love him. He said, great, do that for Mordecai. Well, Haman's day is getting really, really bad, right? Now, we see in verse 13, so Haman told his wife Zeresh, his friends, everything that had happened to him. The wise men and his wife Zeresh said to him, well, if Mordecai, before whom you have begun to fall, is of Jewish descent, you will not prevail against him, but you will surely fall before him. And I'm thinking, if I'm Mordecai, hey, where were you guys yesterday when you told me to build the gallows? Now all of a sudden you change your tune. Maybe you could have thrown in that little thing about him being Jewish back then. Now it's kind of too late. And then verse 14. So while they were still talking with him, the king's eunuchs came, and they hastened to bring Haman to the banquet, which Esther had prepared. Now, if it wasn't bad, it's about to get even worse. Can you imagine being this guy? Now, for all of my hatred of Hollywood and its portrayal of all things, I think that if the right person was writing the script, I would love to watch this play out. Because I'd love to see the expression on his face, if they were trying to capture this on film. Well, chapter 7, verse 1 says, So the king and Haman went to dine with Queen Esther. Neither one of them knows what's coming. Now, of course, Haman's having a bad day. Well, it would have been spectacular compared to what's about to happen. Now, in verse 2, on the second day at the banquet of wine, which is what was going to happen, it was going to be a 2-day feast. And she said, I'll tell you on the second day. Well, the king says, What is your petition? And Queen Esther said, It will be granted to you, Queen Esther. And what is your request? Up to half of the kingdom, and it should be done. Half of the kingdom is just a way of saying, I'll go out of my way to make it worth your while. What is it that you want? So she finds this great favor, and Queen Esther answered and said, If I have found favor in your sight, O king, and if it pleases the king, let my life be given me at my petition, and my people at my request. Now she starts in by saying, my life is in peril and that of my people as well. And she doesn't wait for him to say, well, speak on. She goes right into verse 4. For we have been sold, my people and I, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. By adding annihilation to being killed, it's not just some of us, but as a people wiped out entirely, utterly, completely. So she said, my people have been sold to have this. Had we been sold as male and female slaves, I would have held my tongue, although the enemy would never compensate for the king's loss. Or this loss would never compensate. So if you lost us as slaves, that would have been bad enough. I wouldn't have bothered you. But what is about to happen to us, you could never undo the damage that it would cause to you personally. So it would appear. There's kind of an interesting phrasing in the Hebrew, and there are differing views of it. But the bottom line, it would end up costing the king in ways that he couldn't possibly imagine. Now, at this point, King Ahasuerus answers and said to Queen Esther, Who is he and where is he who would dare presume in his heart to do such a thing? And I'm thinking to myself, Xerxes, you're the king of kind of the known world at the time. Are you that dense you don't remember that you made this deal with Haman? He wanted to wipe out an entire group of people. Have you forgotten? Well, he did so in his greed because he knew he was going to get a lot of money for it, remember? What was it, 10,000 talents of silver? Enormous sums. Like we can't even imagine what that kind of wealth is. But he's the one who made the deal with Haman, and now he's acting all indignant about, oh, who would do such a thing? Well, first of all, king, you said it was cool, but she doesn't say any of that. He just isn't, he's kind of going on. So Esther said, well, the adversary and enemy is this wicked Haman. Now, I would love to see the look on his face. Wouldn't you love to see the video reel of this? When you watch this all go on and the look on his face. Well, it's this wicked Haman. So Haman was terrified before the queen, before the king and the queen. Yeah, I suppose so. Now, when you read the rest of this, you would think, this is just unbelievable how this all goes down. You're almost incredulous when you read it, because nobody could write a script like this. And I know that some people think that it is embellished and all the rest of it. I don't think it is at all. I think it went down just like we have here. God doesn't do things in a superfluous way. He doesn't do stuff just to hear himself talk. He says things and does things the way that he does because he wants to convey a truth, make sure that we understand a situation as it went down. I believe it played out exactly like we read here. There's no reason to think that there's embellishment here. But boy, oh boy, one thing happens after another. And again, if you ever think that you're having a bad day, remember this book. Remember this guy. Because would we all agree? I mean, you've probably all read the book. You probably know the story. But if you were to look at it right here, do you think, man, this just can't get any worse? Oh yeah, it's just getting started. Well, verse 7. So the king arose in his wrath from the banquet of wine, and he went into the palace garden. But Haman stood before Queen Esther, pleading for his life, for he saw that evil was determined against him by the king. Well, now the shoe's on the other foot. There's that irony I was talking about. So he goes, uh-oh, king's going outside. I wonder what's happening. So he goes and tries to throw himself on the mercy of one of the people that he wanted dead, who happens to be related to Mordecai. How bad could this possibly be? Well, When the king returned from the palace garden to the place of the banquet of wine, Haman had fallen across the couch where Esther was. And then the king said, "Will he also assault the queen while I am in the house?" As the word left the king's mouth, he covered Haman's face. So in come the guys to put the bag over his head to take him out for his execution. How bad is this getting? I'm going to go have a banquet of wine with the queen and the king. And now it turns out that the king knows that I was trying to wipe her and everybody else out. He didn't know that Esther was Jewish. God did. Moved her into the right place at the right time just for all of this. So here's what we need to remember. And it's an important reminder to us. Look, you need to realize that the devil devises ways to wipe you out every single day. All day. Looks to do all kinds of horrible, wretched things to you. There are so many times God intervenes and we don't even know it. But to realize that at all times, God has every bit of your life from beginning to end known to him. And he will do whatever is necessary to bring about his will. Well, in this case, we saw it play out in incredible fashion. So here they cover his face. Now, Harbonah, one of the eunuchs, said to the king, "Look, the gallows, 50 cubits high, which Haman made for Mordecai, who spoke good on the king's behalf, is standing at the house of Haman." More irony. So the king said, "Hang him on it." Well, wow. It was supposed to wipe out Mordecai, and it was going to be the beginning, and it would be a precipitous thing happening all throughout the kingdom. All the Jews were going to be wiped out. Haman's not the only bad guy here. We're about to find out that there were a lot of people involved in this conspiracy, but Haman's the only one we know about for now. But more is going to be coming up. Well, here we see, so they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai, and then the king's wrath subsided. Now, I want to remember this, again, because of what I had said earlier about what we are doing as far as our country and the things that are going on in that part of the world with Iran and all the rest. Hey, Iran could be wiped off the planet right here, right now, and everything could be gone. That doesn't fix the problem that the people that are surrounding Israel want them dead. Right now, the biggest antagonists towards Israel are the Islamists. The people that want to see a caliphate all throughout the world, and they want to see Israel eradicated, and they want us gone along with them. So you can get rid of one bad character, but it's going to be a situation where God, as we've been studying on Sunday mornings, he clears the deck, folks. And he doesn't allow it to start up again. So he gets rid of corruption. Well, in this case, it was kind of the same type of a thing. These people had evil intent in their heart. God manifests it and then wipes them out. Now, in verse 1 of chapter 8. So on that day, King Ahasuerus gave Queen Esther the house of Haman. More irony. I didn't even do this. I should have written down all the ironic twists in this. It would be kind of interesting. I'd probably run out of lead in my pencil. But Ahasuerus gave Queen Esther the house of Haman, the enemy of the Jews, and Mordecai came before the king, for Esther had told how he was related to her. And you wonder if King Ahasuerus, or Xerxes, whatever we want to call him, if he started to put some things together. Wow, there's a lot of stuff going on here that's quite coincidental. How is it that of all the women who had paraded before me, it could actually be Esther that I would have chosen, and that she would have been related to the guy that saved my life? What's the chances? Well, God was at work, needless to say. Well, verse 2 said, so the king took off his signet ring, which he had taken from Haman, and he gave it to Mordecai. Some more irony. And Esther appointed Mordecai over the house of Haman. So everything that Haman had was now given to Mordecai. Even you know what the signet ring is? That's like official business for the king. The signet ring would be the thing if they were going to put the wax on the paper and melt it down, and you put the signet ring on it that leaves that impression. That's the king's authority was given to him. And we're going to see it's played out that way. Now, verse 3. Now Esther spoke again to the king, fell down at his feet, implored him with tears, and to counteract the evil of Haman the Agagite, and the scheme which he had devised against the Jews. And the king held out the golden scepter towards Esther. So Esther arose and stood before the king. And she said, "If it pleases the king, and if I have found favor in your sight, and these things seem right to the king, and if it's pleasing in your eyes, then let it be written to revoke the letters devised by Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, which he wrote to annihilate the Jews who are in the king's provinces." So she sees that there is still work to be done. Now, I've escaped. Mordecai has escaped. Haman's dead. But what about all of my people that are in those provinces? Because that edict is still in place, and that deadline's coming. So, for now, I can endure to see the evil, or for how can I endure to see the evil that will come upon my people, or how can I endure to see the destruction of my countrymen? Then King Ahasuerus said to Queen Esther and to Mordecai the Jew, "Indeed, I have given Esther the house of Haman, and they have hanged him on the gallows because he tried to lay his hand on the Jews. You yourself write a decree concerning the Jews, as you please, in the king's name, and seal it with the king's signet ring. For wherever it is written in the king's name and sealed in the king's signet, no one can revoke it." More irony. Now, not only at this point did God come to their assistance, he would have done so much above what they could have ever imagined, and here it is. Now, some people would look at this and say, wow, the king was really, really generous. Frankly, I think God's leading him around by the nose. He's making him do all the things that he wants done here. And I have every belief that God has put it in, and it is such an extreme example of his intervention. He wanted this recorded. And he wants for us to read this. He wants us to understand that he does not take as a trivial thing when people devise ways to try to thwart his will. The devil has known all along the love that God has for his people Israel. Not because of their perfection. Most of the time as we read their history, they were kind of indifferent and in all kinds of messed up ways. But they had those times where they were really doing very, very well, and they would see his favor. Well, again, they're seeing his favor in him bringing them back into the land, but they've yet to really acknowledge him. Here's the great news. As we study through the prophets, that day's coming. He will once again reestablish his people in their land, and he will gather the tribes together yet again. They've never been together since the northern tribes were wiped out by the Assyrians, but that day's coming. No doubt. Just be patient, because we'll see it. Okay. So this all happens, and then verse 9 says, "Now the king's scribes were called at that time in the 3rd month, which is the month of Sivan, and on the 23rd day, and it was written according to all that Mordecai had commanded, to the Jews, to the satraps, to the governors, to the princes of the provinces of India and Ethiopia, 127 provinces." Now, India to Ethiopia, think about that. We're talking about Iran, modern day. So we know that that extends all the way into, all the way to the Mediterranean Sea, to the known world. We're even talking about the northern part of Africa. That's how far this had to go, and it was going to take months to travel that far. So by this time, what Haman wanted to do was already out there, and now this is going to be the complete, and I mean the polar opposite. Everything that was supposed to happen is going to be flipped on its ear. Now, we see here in verse, at the end of it, from India to Ethiopia, 127 provinces in all, to every province in its own script, its own people in their own language, and to the Jews in their own script and in their own language. Think about the undertaking of that. All those languages, all those people, to get it put together and then send them all out. Now, verse 10 tells us, "And he wrote in the name of King Ahasuerus, sealed it with the king's signet ring, and sent letters by couriers on horseback, riding on royal horses bred from swift steeds." Well, it was going to need all of that because it had to go to the far-flung reaches, right? Couldn't just send a text. Well, verse 11, "By these letters the king permitted the Jews who were in every city to gather together and to protect their lives, to destroy, kill, and annihilate all the forces of any people or province that would assault them, both little children and women, to the plunder of their possessions." So boy, this went a lot further. Don't kill the Jews, but now you governors and all you people in the far-flung regions, when the Jews realized that there were those who looked to do them harm, now the Jews have the ability to go and wipe them out. Wow. Wow. Talk about irony, huh? So, Verse 12. On one day in all the provinces, King Ahasuerus, on the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar. That's when it was all going to take place. Why is that significant? Because that's when Haman had decided that that's when the Jews were going to be wiped out. So even to the day that it was supposed to happen, God's turned it around. It's totally the opposite way. Again, irony, yeah? Well, it says a copy of the document was to be issued as a decree in every province and published for all the people, so that the Jews would be ready on the day to avenge themselves on their enemies. The couriers who rode on royal horses went out, hastened and pressed on by the king's command, and the decree was issued in Shushan, the citadel. So that's really the seat of power. So that's where it all started, if you think about it. That's where Esther is. That's where Mordecai is. That's where Haman was. That's where all of this was taking place. Even what happens at the citadel after this is of significance, as we're going to read in the next chapter. Verse 15, so Mordecai went out from the presence of the king in royal apparel of blue and white, with a great crown of gold and a garment of fine linen and purple, in the city of Shushan, rejoiced and was glad. The Jews had light and gladness, joy and honor. Boy, how things have changed for them. These were the people that had gone around in sackcloth and ashes because a death sentence had been decreed against them, and there was nowhere to run. And it was going to happen all throughout this empire. Who knows how many there could have been? Certainly hundreds of thousands, if not millions of them, would have been wiped out at the decree of the king because of what Haman wanted to do. So, of course, there was. Now, and in every province and city, wherever the king's command and decree came, the Jews had joy and gladness, a feast and a holiday. Then many of the people of the land became Jews, because fear of the Jews fell upon them all. Oh my. Wow. Now imagine. Now see, here's one of the things that's interesting, again ironic, because if you haven't already noticed, if you've been here for this whole study, you can't help but see God's hand all over this. And yet God's not mentioned in this entire book. Not once do you see the name God. Not once. But it is as unmistakable as it can possibly be that He's involved in all of this. Now people are coming to faith in who He is based upon what they see Him do. Isn't that interesting? Now, what it should do is grab our attention very quickly, is just to say, you want for people to notice what God does in you so much so that they ask you, please tell me what it is with you. Right? Because that's what happened here. How could such a thing be? Now, if they're paying attention, they would say, our God has come to our rescue. And it doesn't make any sense, earthly speaking. There's no way this should have ever gone down like it did. There are too many things that had to happen perfectly and in the correct order. No one could have orchestrated this. No possible way. The right people had to be in the right places at the right time, and all that took forethought. And they had nothing to do with it, needless to say. And then all these things needed to happen. They had to fall like dominoes into place, or else the whole thing comes apart. Well, so it should be with us as well. People should be able to see that there is favor in your life. And I'm not talking in a material sense. That's bad doctrine that you see preached in some churches. Well, you're going to get all kinds of material things, and then people are going to think that God's involved with your life. No, they're going to think that you're greedy and ambitious. But if there's some kind of an ability to cope with the day-to-day of stuff that you don't react like the rest of the world does, there's a demeanor about you and a manner of lifestyle, the way that you talk, the way that you do things, how you carry yourself. Yeah, you want that to speak volumes that people would come and ask. So, interesting little, just a caveat, something to throw out there to you. Now, chapter 9 tells us this. Now, in the 12th month, that is in the month of Adar, on the 13th day, the time came for the king's command and for his decree to be executed. Now, on the day that the enemies of the Jews had hoped to overpower them, now notice it's the enemies, plural. It's not just Haman. But there were people that were on board with this. That's an important matter. So there were a number of people involved in this, and we're going to find out how many that actually was. We get a little bit of an accounting. So here's the day that they thought it was going to be, and now the tables have completely turned. The opposite thing occurred, it says in verse 1. in that the Jews themselves overpowered those who hated them. And there's your issue, hatred. Hatred of the people, the Jewish people. Nothing has changed. If you ever want to know why is it, whether it was Hitler and looking for his eradication, whether it was from the moment of their inception as a people, there have always been those who had wanted to destroy it. If it wasn't Pharaoh, it was the ites that lived around them, all around the people there of Israel. Or again, in our modern times, if it's Hitler, or if it's all of the Islamists in this part or in that part of the world that are looking to wipe them out. It's a repeating thing, so you have to ask yourself. Different people, languages, cultures, times. Yet the one thing that remains is this hated small group of people called the Jews. How could they be so, of all of the people that have ever existed, so roundly hated in such an unnatural way? It has to have a spiritual explanation. There is just a demonic hatred of these people. Demonic. There's only one explanation for it. Well, we're reading one of many times in their history where such a thing had taken place. Well, verse 2, the Jews gathered together in their cities throughout all of the provinces of King Ahasuerus to lay hands on those who sought their harm. Now, this is not the laying on of hands that we might think in the peaceful sense. This is what you guys wanted to do. Now it's come back on you. Once again, what's the operative word here? Irony. Yep, there it is. Irony. So they laid hands on them, and no one could withstand them because fear of them fell upon all people, and all the officials of the provinces, the satraps, the governors, and all those doing the king's work helped the Jews because the fear of Mordecai had fallen upon them. Oh yeah, that Mordecai that they had built gallows to hang him on. Yeah, that guy. The same one that when Haman wanted to wipe him out, that Haman died on the same gallows that he had made for that guy. Now, if you've heard this whole story, would you, if you're one of these people, think, maybe I'll take my shot at Mordecai? Probably not. Probably not. Well, verse 4 says, so Mordecai, because Mordecai was great in the king's palace, and his fame spread throughout all of the provinces. Well, yeah, I hope so, because he's the guy sending out the letters, and he's the guy that's put the king's stamp of approval on it because he's got the ring. Yeah, this is Haman on steroids. We understand this, right? All right. So, I don't know that steroids existed at the time, but you get the imagery, right? All right. For Mordecai was great in the king's palace, and his fame spread throughout all the provinces. For this man Mordecai became increasingly prominent. Thus the Jews defeated all of their enemies with the stroke of the sword, with slaughter, and with destruction. What was intended for them comes back on those that were their enemies, and did what they pleased with those who hated them. Now notice it wasn't just, hey, now that we got the power, we're just going to go crazy. No. It was only those people that were enemies. And let's make sure that we're very careful about this. God hates indiscriminate killing. Hates it. Despises it. Gives sanction, though, when it is a matter of self-preservation. And if something like this had not been done, then it kind of makes you wonder, can we just wait for things to settle down a little bit? When nobody's paying attention, we'll go back and take those people out. No. Somebody was going to be put down here. And it was either going to be, as Haman had wanted, the Jews, or it was going to be those who were the enemies, and a statement was being made here. Let's make sure we understand that. God has made plenty of statements through the ages. The problem is that mankind, we're pretty dense, aren't we? We don't learn very well. Well, so it was with them. Well, here we go. Now, verse 6, now in Shushan, the citadel, the Jews killed and destroyed 500 men. Also, these 10 boys with unpronounceable names that belonged to Haman, his kids, his sons, right? So they're all put to death, 500 plus the kids. Now look at what ends up happening. The 10 sons of Haman, verse 10 tells us, the son of Hammedatha, the enemy of the Jews, they killed, but they did not lay hand on the plunder. Let's make sure we're careful of looking at that, because it will be repeated. They were not in this for the money. They were in this for preservation. And this would be something that was going to have, it would redound throughout that point of that history, maybe it's not a good idea to pick a fight with Jewish people, even when it looks like they are in a place of not only servitude, but real weakness. Let's remember what's happened at this point. This was not happening in Israel. This was not even happening in Babylon, because so long had they been in their captivity that the Persians had already taken out Nebuchadnezzar. So this has gone from the Babylonian exile to now the next world empire, the Medo-Persians, of which Xerxes was the king. And they had been moved from Babylon, Iraq, to Persia, to Iran, modern day. So a lot has happened. This is at the latter part of that exile, because as we're studying through this, if you've been here for the whole thing, we're really in the minor prophets in our move through the Old Testament. But I think it's very important for us to recognize three prominent books from the same era of time: Esther, Ezra, Nehemiah. Because they're the ones that were involved at that time of rebuilding. Shortly after this whole episode, more than likely, is when Ezra and Nehemiah were going to be heading back, staggered by about, I think, 10 years or so. But they were going to go back to Jerusalem. They were going to go back to rebuild the walls and to re-implement the worship there at Jerusalem. So this is the latter part. By this time, Zerubbabel's probably already gone back to start the initial. That first wave's gone back. That gives us an idea of around the time. That's all happening. So it's in that time, what we are studying in the prophets, we wanted to bring it in chronologically before we get to what we call the post-exile prophets. Those ones that were writing at the time when they had returned to the land through the administration mainly of Ezra and Nehemiah. So that's why we're doing Esther right here, right now. Okay, is all that clear? All right, great. So what we see here, these 10 sons. Now verse 11 says, "Now on that day, the number of," that day being the one that Haman had wanted to wipe out all the Jews, and it got turned on them, "those that were killed in Shushan, the citadel, was brought to the king. And the king said to Queen Esther, 'The Jews have killed and destroyed 500 men in Shushan, the citadel, and the 10 sons of Haman. Now, what have they done in the rest of the king's provinces? Now, what is your petition? It shall be granted to you,' or what is the further request? 'It shall be done.'" Now, I don't know about you, but wouldn't you think, "No, I'm good. That's fine. Everything's taken care of." Well, no, Esther's not done. So she says, "Well, Esther said, 'Now, if it pleases the king, let it be granted to the Jews who are at Shushan to do again tomorrow, according to today's decree, and let Haman's sons be hanged in the gallows.'" They're already dead. "Hang them as a sign to everyone, and let us pick up the slaughter tomorrow here in Shushan." Not in the provinces. Right here at the seat of power. So let's put all of Haman's kids who are already dead, and let's hang them so that everybody can see not only Haman but his family are put up there in a way of total degradation. Sounds cruel. Unless, of course, you're wanting to say, let us remember that the punishment fits the crime. And then some. Your actions are going to even affect your kids. Be careful what you do. That's the picture here. Now, you can maybe picture Ahasuerus saying, "Aren't you satisfied? It's enough." But he's already said, "Up to half of my kingdom." So the king commanded this to be done, and the decree was issued in Shushan, and they hanged Haman's 10 sons. And the Jews who were at Shushan gathered together again on the 14th day of the month, the day after the first decree of Adar, and they killed 300 men at Shushan, but they did not lay hands on the plunder. So they didn't go into their houses. They didn't take anything from it. Now, this is the citadel. How many hundreds of thousands of people may have lived there? And yet we're talking about a total of 800 people plus Haman's kids. It wasn't as though things went nuts. This was surgical. And it was intended to be such, because God doesn't take any pleasure in just wiping out people arbitrarily. There is always a reason for it. There is always reason behind it, and so it was with this. So verse 16 says, "The remainder of the Jews in the king's provinces gathered together and protected their lives, had rest from their enemies, and they killed 75 1,000 of their enemies, but they did not lay hand on the plunder. This speaks so well of them, because not just in Shushan, maybe where all the eyes were watching, but I think it would have been a bad report no matter what. If it had come back to the king, throughout your provinces there was a total of 75,000 of your subjects put to death. If you'd have thought of how many Jews would have been put to death, it would have 75,000 would have been eclipsed probably in just one of the provinces. The sheer number of it would have been amazing. But it wouldn't have looked good if they had said, and in a few of the provinces, not only did they kill everybody, they took all their stuff too. That would really look bad. So I find it important that God made sure that He gave the instruction. However He did it, His people did this to the person, not to take plunder, which was really kind of the way that people did stuff like that. You defeat them, you take what they had. You beat them, then everything is yours. They didn't do any of that stuff. So they dealt only with the people and not with the stuff. I think that's very important. Now, verse 17, this was on the 13th day of the month of Adar, and on the 14th of the month they rested and made it a day of feasting and gladness. So the provinces had one day where they took retribution on their enemies, and the following day was a day of feasting and gladness. Well, who were they feasting and saying that they were glad to? Of course, it was God. They saw Him in this whole thing. The book doesn't say that, but it's obvious. You put together a feast. And so there's something different about what happened in the citadel, what we call Shushan. Verse 18, but the Jews who were at Shushan assembled together on the 13th day as well as on the 14th day, and then on the 15th day of the month they rested, and they made it a day of feasting and gladness. So because of that extended day, then their observances were 2 days of what they were going to do, and then on that third day was their day of feasting and of gladness. So then, verse 19, therefore the Jews in the villages who dwelt in the unwalled towns celebrated on the 14th day of the month with gladness and feasting as a holiday and for the sending of presents to one another. Interestingly enough, this still goes on to the day, and here's where the institution of what we call Purim is. Now, the Pur was the casting of lots. That was how it was determined. So when are we going to do this? When Haman got the okay to wipe them all out. I don't know, let's cast lots. Well, it turned out it's on the 12th month, 13th day. That became the decree. We cast lots for it. That we've cast the Pur. And so the Feast of Purim is the recognition on the day that lots were cast to wipe out the Jews, that God turned it around in an ultimate twist of irony across the board, and it turned out to be a day when God had delivered His people in a miraculous way. So Mordecai wrote these things, verse 20. He wrote these things, he sent letters to all the Jews near and far who were in the provinces of King Ahasuerus to establish among them that they should celebrate yearly the 14th and the 15th days of the month of Adar. And as the days on which Jews had rest from their enemies, as the month which was turned from sorrow to joy for them, and from mourning to a holiday, that they should make them days of fasting and of joy, or feasting rather, and of joy, and sending presents to one another and gifts to the poor. Well, this was to be a commemoration, and I think it's an apt thing to do. And it happens to this day, by the way. The Feast of Purim is recognized by Jews all over the world to this day. And it's for the same things. Now, if we were to go into a synagogue and watch this, they read this entire book. You may know this, but they read this entire book, and I think it's kind of fun because they do still give gifts to one another, and they commemorate the day, and they've got all kinds of noise things. The things you can, with your hand, they make that crazy noise, or whistles, or whatever you can do to drown out sound, because every time that Haman's name is mentioned, they make a noise that you can't even hear his name. Yep. I think that's just cool. Again, more irony. Because Haman's a prominent figure in this, but every time that they're going to say his name as they read it, you can't hear it. They drown him out with noise. I love that. That is just so interesting. Well, it still goes on to this day. So the Jews accepted the custom which they had begun as Mordecai had written to them, because Haman the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the enemy of the Jews, had plotted against the Jews to annihilate them and to cast Pur, that is, the lot, to consume them and to destroy them. But when Esther came before the king, he commanded by letter that this wicked plot which Haman had devised against the Jews should return on his own head, and that he and his sons would be hanged in the gallows. Now, of course, this was something that when Esther was given the opportunity, she said, this is what we should do. Now, the king went along with it. And again, I am absolutely sure, I am convinced, that this is how God wanted it to be. I find it interesting that it says this Haman, the Agagite, the son of that guy, the enemy of the Jews, and it gives all that list of who and what he was. Is supposed to be a reminder to those that read, this is what ultimately befalls those who hate Jews just because of who they are. Demonically inspired. Again, I'm thinking about what's taken place half a world away. So, I believe that we, this nation and its leadership, are profoundly foolish to be talking with people who are absolutely petty terrorists. The leadership in Iran have no intention of doing the right thing. They know that they can play us because we're desperate, and the rest of the world is as well. They will not make good on their promises. They have every intention of using their ability to wipe out Israel. They think that it is their God-given right to do so. So, if I laid that all out for you, how do you think it's going to end for them? We read the book of Revelation. We already know how it works out for them. We know Ezekiel 38 says how it works out for them too, which is a battle that is still future. They're second behind Russia in that list of nations that come against. It doesn't go very well for them. Well, verse 29. Then Queen Esther, the daughter of Abihail, with Mordecai the Jew, wrote with full authority to confirm the second letter about Purim. So not only did they say, take vengeance against those that wanted to kill you, now here's a follow-up to it. Now every year when this time rolls around, do a commemoration, give gifts to one another, and celebrate what just took place. Make it a remembrance. And isn't this great? And how often we see this, that even in times of being in a place where they shouldn't be in the first place, that God gives them favor. Think of Joseph under Pharaoh. Think of Daniel in his time that he spent in captivity as well. Now here you have Esther. And so it is. You know, it's not the ideal. It never should have been. Let's remind ourselves of that. When it comes to this exile, when it comes to Daniel, when it comes to Ezekiel, when it comes to these people that were in exile, when it comes to all of those people, had their fathers before them walked in fellowship with God and did as He had asked, none of this had to happen. None of it. They shouldn't have been in captivity in the first place, but they were there because of their rebellion. Simple. And even in that, God shows them favor. Boy, that gives hope to me. Because every day I will demonstrate my failure to do as God asks me to do, as all of us will. But to know that we are in a place of favor and never have to question it, how do we know? Jesus died for my sin. And He's my Lord. He's my Master. He's my King of Kings. And He loves me. Not because I'm perfect, not by a long shot, but because He's the one who makes promises and sustains. Amazing stuff, huh? Verse 31 rather. Verse 30. So Mordecai sent letters to all the Jews, to the 127 provinces in the kingdom of Ahasuerus, with words of peace and of truth, to confirm these days of Purim at the appointed time, as Mordecai the Jew and Queen Esther had prescribed for them, and as they had decreed for themselves and for their descendants concerning matters of their fasting and their lamenting. So the decree of Esther confirmed these matters of Purim, and it was written in the book. Now, again, the last of the ironic things, it doesn't really end there because of Mordecai. He continues in this place of prominence. So the last 3 verses, very short chapter, 3 verses. Chapter 10 says, Now King Ahasuerus imposed tribute on the land and on the islands of the sea. Now all the acts of his power and his might and the account of the greatness of Mordecai, to which the king advanced him, Are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Media and Persia? Well, there were chronicles for those guys too. We look at the chronicles of the Old Testament, and it's talking about those kings as well. So it is a historical ledger of those kings. But isn't it funny, isn't it interesting how Mordecai would be more than just a footnote in the history of a Persian kingdom? This Jewish man is going to be figuring very prominently throughout the history of the Medo-Persian kings. So I just find that to be, ironic. Now, for Mordecai, the Jew was second to King Ahasuerus and was great among the Jews and well received by the multitude of his brethren, seeking the good of his people and speaking peace to all of his countrymen. So this was not a guy who abused his position from all that you can see here. And again, when we see the way that they took retribution against their enemies, you could see that it was by no means indiscriminate. It was very careful. It was very surgical. Exactly what you would expect if God was the one having him do as he did. It doesn't have to be over the top because that's the way that the world works things. This was done just to deal with the immediate threat. Pretty interesting. So with that, we will, next week, we will start in with Nehemiah, and we'll start to study through that book too. And so these historical, the reason why they're not in with the prophets is because the prophets were speaking to the people. But chronologically, this is at the same time. That's where these books are put with the historical ones, why they're so much further in the front of the Old Testament. They're dealing with the history, but that history and the historical events of that time fit where the prophets were speaking. So that's why I have them there at that time. So with that, let's stand. We'll have a closing song, and we'll get out about 5 minutes early.